Hi everyone, I'm Sanna Börjesson and I will be doing this week's presentation on one of the articles that we could choose from when we started this literature course. Before I start, I would just like to mention, since this topic concerns colonialism in Africa, I would just like to mention that when I was studying history at at Jönköping University, I took an advanced course in the transatlantic slave trade, and I read about 2,500 pages written both by African writers and European writers on the subject. I'm not sure if this might have influenced my reading, both reading this article and Akebe's book Thing Falls Apart, but I would just like to mention that I have some knowledge of the history aspect of colonial times in Africa, but particularly the transatlantic slave trade. So this is sort of my personal reflection on this matter. Anyhow, I've decided to divide this presentation into two sections, mainly because the articles have a somewhat distinguished perspective on the subject matter. And also because the two articles are being written by different authors, but they share the theme of decolonizing African literature and problematize the concept of I'm losing words, colonialist criticism, sorry. And I will try to do this as coherent as I possibly can, but I've never done a video presentation of this kind before. I'm used to the human interactions while doing a oral presentation of something, but it's new for me, so we'll see how it goes, but hopefully I will be as coherent as I possibly can. Okay, back to the article. The first section is written by Chinua Achebe. I do apologize if I pronounce it wrong. His article is on the topic colonialist criticism. He starts off by deconstructing, or rather problematize, the concept of the word colonialist, because he writes that on one hand it's connected to the belief that Africans now must take responsibility for their problems rather than blaming others, and by others they mean the white man or Europe or the Western world. On the other hand, the concept of the word colonialist is connected to a new relationship between masters and servants that now presumably should be considered equals. But again, this is a problem because that's not the case. And the point being by Achebe, I believe, is that he wants to show that colonialist is a much more difficult concept to grasp than one might seem at a first glance. You know, all of us get our own views and our own thoughts when we hear the word colonialist and colonialism and imperialism in Africa. The thesis that Achebe wants to point out is that there is a problem, and it's divided Europe and Africa, and here is where the problem lies, because even if Africans would conform to European standards and write in a European fashion or whatever, just conform to European traditions, they will never be considered equals. And this is the point that Achebe wants to point out in his article, and a problem that is connected to colonialist criticism. So his intention with this article is to discuss colonialist criticism. He does so by using his own experiences. He very early on in his article points out that this is my experiences and this is my point of view, although he uses other critics and other writers to sort of help strengthen his own arguments and to prove a point that others share the same experience or others share the same theories about the matter. And the main thesis in his text is that all African writers go through the judgment of European writers, and this leads to a lingering of colonialism in theory and in practice to some extent, even to this day, because this article was written a few years ago. But a personal reflection is that after reading these articles, colonialism still lingers in the world today, and we need to be aware of that, especially when reading African literature or any literature on the topic. And he also says that there is a big brother, little brother complex that still lives on between Europe and Africa, or the Western world and Africa. To showcase this, he brings out Anna Tracy and Iris Andrensky, who are two writers that Akibi uses as a reference to show how condescending some can be when it comes to African literature and African writers. Tracy, for example, mentions Africa's inglorious past and that Europe brought civilization to Africa, and lastly that Africa should be thankful for this. They should be thankful for the fact that Europe brought civilization to Africa, as if there weren't no civilization at all. And again, this is wrong. Africa had a great civilization before, in the pre-colonial days. So this is a problem when it comes to colonialist criticism. Andrensky, on the other hand, takes this even further by almost pointing out that she possesses more knowledge of Africa than the African writer himself. And this strengthened Akibi's argument that no matter what Africa does, no matter how Africa conforms, they will never be considered equal, because they are always judged from a Western viewpoint or a European viewpoint. He also mentions the language. I believe that maybe he wants to show that he's aware of the problem, but he also uses it to show that Africans need, and this is not a form of standing in line, and I'm talking about the way that African writers are using the English language when they write. And this is basically, as Akibi writes, a way of being heard. They need to write in English in order to get their stories out there. And this leads also to a discussion about universalism, which Akibi does not like at all. Many criticism against African literature is the fact that if you just change the names or change the setting of the novel, it can take place anywhere in the world, being a universal story. To counter-argue this, Akibi writes that none of these European critics or writers ever considered doing the same on their novels, meaning that if you take a Western novel and just change the names to take place in Africa, would it be universal as well? But this has never occurred to them, meaning that he has a problem with universalism. I think that Akibi have a very interesting argument about this, because he points to different aspects, and he's very clear that it's his own reflection and his own experience that is being upheld, but he uses other critics to prove his point. So I personally think this is a very good article. It made me think, and it made me think, since I'm a part of the European society and the European world, did I read the novel in a specific way, or did I interpret it in in a different way because of my heritage being a European. And that's something I would like to reread the novel Things Fall Apart now after reading these articles. The second part of the article is about is written by three authors, Chinwezu, Jemi, and Madubuki. And their main topic is about decolonizing African literature. They want to take the colonialism away from Africa in order to really appreciate the African literature and making the African literature its own. And they also start off by Akebe to point out and problematize the fact that a novel or the novel is a Western thing. It is a European thing. And it has almost become the norm. When people talk about the novel, it is what we in the Western world call a novel. And if we talk about a novel from China, we say a Chinese novel or an African novel or a French novel. Sorry, not a French novel since that's in Europe, but you get what I'm saying. And the concept is that a novel, the concept of what a novel is and how it is constructed is made on Western terms. And therefore, again, Europe will always judge Africa from their point of view, since they made the rules and they believe that they have somewhat discovered civilization and literature first before everyone else. And applying this on other cultures makes, it becomes a conflict of interest almost. For me, this is a very interesting viewpoint because I've never even considered this. Again, probably because I'm from Europe, and when I hear the novel, I just think, oh, it's a book with its structures, its plots and settings and everything. But it becomes very interesting, and clearly I can see the problem that this brings, especially when talking about colonialist criticism. It's almost like a catch-22 where Europeans want to civilize the African continent, yet they will never be seen as equals. So after discussing the concept of the word novel and the problem it brings when talking about colonialist criticism, they continue to discuss African writers and the African past, almost like what do African writers bring and how do they see the world. And this is also a very interesting discussion because even African writers are somewhat conformed, or they are somewhat formed because some of them, or many of them, grew up in an imperial, in a colonialist world. The authors establishes three attitudes which are dominant when it comes to the African past. They start off by naming shamefaced rejection, romantic embrace, and realistic appraisal. And to me, I think that these three categories represent all colonialist criticism. Those who wish to forget everything and those who want to tell it as it is. So the spectrum is rather vast and it contains everything. And the authors also point out that because of Africa's imperial history, Africa need to reclaim their genuine past. Again, decolonizing Africa or decolonizing African literature. They need to reclaim, and this is very important. The authors are being very, they point to this and they use this as a great argument. And they also need to reclaim their past without the imperial framework, or imperial, maybe it's not, colonialist framework that was forced upon the African continent. In the article, they point out problems which this repossession leads to. They write that most African writers and critics approach this matter with either romanticism or realistic realism. There is no nuance here. And the background for this discussion is negritude, and they present three aspects of it. First, it's national consciousness that revolts against Western imperialism, and they praise this. They think it's a very good thing because the national consciousness is an important part for African liberation. They need it, and they applaud this. And secondly, negritude shows a concern of how to recapture the oral tradition, because this is connected to how we perceive the novel. They write that some people doesn't think that Africa had novels in pre-colonial days because of its oral tradition, and a novel is, strictly speaking, something that should be written down. But they argue against this, saying that because of its great oral tradition, they have great novels, but they're never being written down. And to show this, they use a good argument by comparing this to Western oral traditions such as Beowulf, the old Greek epics like the Iliad, for example. They were, from the beginning, oral histories, and then they were being written down. And comparing to Africa, they use this as an argument of showing there were loads of novels and there was a great tradition in Africa before, or in the pre-colonial times. And lastly, there is an aspect of negritude, and that's the image of traditional Africa which they want to hold up to view. They praise the traditions, the old Africa. And this is the only aspect of negritude they point out of being a bit concerned about, or they're being a bit conservative with their opinion of this, because the authors question this last aspect, since it portrays a rather bland view of African past, a romantic view of the past rather than a nuanced one, that it was all fantastic and there were, it was peace and quiet on the African continent before the colonialist came. And when decolonizing African literature, both writers and critics must be careful not to take any particular side. I believe this is difficult, and I believe it's difficult to give an honest and fair portrait of a continent such as Africa because of its past. Everything is connected to something else. Even if you're an African writer, you might be influenced by imperialism subconsciously, or portrayed a much more romantic perspective of Africa's past, just like a Western writer will see the African continent through Western eyes. And this is where I believe is the biggest issue when it comes to African literature, because people from the Western world see it as African literature. And what's also interesting, taking into perspective, is the fact that Akibe himself, would we consider him an African writer, or is he a world writer? That's an interesting aspect as well to take into consideration when talking about these subjects. I hope that this was somewhat coherent, and I hope you got a summary of what the articles was about and the main idea. I think they are well written, and they use arguments to support their own, but also arguments that is against their opinions, making it a nuanced image. But again, these writers come from a background, and I have a background, so my interpretation and my way of reading this might differ from yours or anyone else. But this was 2 articles about colonialist criticism and decolonizing African literature. Thank you.